Silvervale, Colorado. Population just under 25,000. A quiet mountain town tucked between pine-covered ridges and the kind of postcard sunsets that make people believe bad things don't happen here. But that's the thing about places like Silvervale. The darkness never announces itself. It waits, quietly, behind drawn curtains and closed apartment doors. Evelyn Hart had been living in Silvervale for a little over 8 months. She was 29, a real estate agent who'd left Florida chasing a new start, one that was supposed to be calm, simple, adult. Her friends described her as patient, almost too patient, the kind of person who apologized even when someone else stepped on her foot. She rented a small apartment at Aspen Hollow Apartments, 3rd floor, Unit 3B. Nothing fancy, 2 rooms, beige carpet, balcony facing the ridge. The kind of place meant for beginnings. And at first, that's exactly what it was. Evelyn's move west had been impulsive. After a messy breakup back home and a job that left her burned out, she packed her car, drove cross-country, and promised herself she'd stay busy enough not to think about the past. It worked. By spring, she'd landed a position with a mid-sized real estate agency downtown. Her coworkers said she had a natural touch with clients, calm, reassuring, able to make anyone believe a small apartment was a fresh start. It was during one of those after-work celebrations at a hotel bar called the Grand Horizon Resort that she met Lucas Monroe. Lucas was the head bartender, 30 years old, easy smile, crisp shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows. The kind of man who remembered names, who looked you directly in the eye, who made you feel like you were the only person in the room. That first night, he slid a napkin toward her with a quiet joke about selling him a better apartment someday. They talked for hours, about traveling, family, and how both of them were finally getting life on track. To Evelyn, he felt safe. To Lucas, she was easy to read. By the end of summer, they were inseparable. In October, they signed a lease together for Unit 3B. The neighbors remembered them as polite but distant. Evelyn often carried groceries alone, while Lucas came home late, still in his bar uniform, smelling faintly of whiskey and citrus. Inside, things were less balanced. Evelyn's messages to her sister hinted at tension, playful teasing that sometimes crossed a line, arguments about money, about her long hours, about trust. Still, she stayed. She told friends she believed in second chances. Then, in February, she found out she was pregnant. Her sister said Evelyn sounded both terrified and strangely peaceful. She wanted the baby. She said it made everything make sense again. Lucas's reaction, however, was harder to read. When she told him, he paused, smiled faintly, and asked, "Are you sure?" That was it. No hug, no excitement, just those 2 words. In the weeks that followed, his distance grew. He'd vanish after work, claim double shifts, come home well past midnight. Evelyn excused it as stress, or maybe fear. She told her mother, "He'll come around. He just needs time." But by May, time was running out. On Monday, May 23rd, Evelyn stopped by her doctor for a regular checkup. The baby was healthy, strong heartbeat, normal development. She left the clinic smiling. The nurse remembered she said she couldn't wait to decorate the nursery. That same afternoon, Lucas texted her saying he'd be late again. At the bar, he was seen talking closely with a young hotel assistant manager, Natalie Reeves, who had started working there earlier that spring. Natalie was bright, professional, and unaware that Lucas already lived with someone. By Thursday, Evelyn's messages had taken a darker tone. "We need to talk," she wrote him that evening. He replied hours later, "I'm tired. Tomorrow." The next day, neighbors reported hearing raised voices around 10:30 p.m. Then silence. Saturday, May 28th, light rain. Temperatures in the 40s. Lucas walked into the Silvervale Police Department just before noon. He told officers that his girlfriend, Evelyn Hart, hadn't come home. He said they'd argued the night before, that she'd left to clear her head. He described it as a normal fight that got too loud. Detective Miles Grant, the lead investigator on duty that morning, noted how calm Lucas seemed. No shaking hands, no nervous pacing, just a man answering questions in full sentences, like he'd rehearsed them. When officers asked what she'd taken with her, Lucas said, her wallet, phone, maybe her passport. She likes to drive when she's upset. He didn't mention the prenatal vitamins still sitting on the kitchen counter, the half-packed suitcase by the door, or the ultrasound photo tucked inside a frame on her nightstand. Within hours, Evelyn's family in Florida received a text from her number, "I'm fine. Need space. Don't worry." Her mother replied instantly. The message was never read. At first, no one panicked. Adults vanish for a night, couples fight, sometimes people really do need space. But by Sunday evening, something felt wrong. Evelyn's coworkers reported her missing after she failed to show up for 2 open house events. She never missed appointments. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Her car, a silver Subaru, was still parked behind the apartment complex. When Detective Grant and 2 patrol officers entered Unit 3B that night, nothing looked out of place. No sign of forced entry, no overturned furniture. Just absence. The coffee table was wiped clean except for 1 glass half full of orange juice, faint lipstick on the rim. Her purse hung on a hook by the door. Her maternity coat was still on the chair. Grant later wrote in his notes, "Apartment neat, too neat, absence of daily clutter. Smelled faintly of bleach." They took samples from the kitchen counter and bathroom tiles. Lucas allowed them to search the place but kept emphasizing how worried he was. He repeated the same story 3 times, almost word for word. "We argued, she left, I went to bed. When I woke up, she was gone." Grant asked him to stay available for more questioning. Lucas nodded, calm, cooperative, too cooperative. By Monday, the case was all over town. Flyers with Evelyn's photo appeared at gas stations and diners. A small crowd gathered outside the apartment building that night holding candles. But inside the Silvervale precinct, new evidence was already shifting the tone. The lab report showed traces of diluted cleaning chemicals in the bathroom and kitchen, stronger than typical household use. A neighbor on the second floor came forward, saying she heard the washing machine running around 3 a.m. and smelled something like burning plastic. And when detectives pulled surveillance footage from the building's parking garage, they saw Lucas Monroe leaving just before dawn, carrying what looked like 2 heavy black garbage bags. He returned 45 minutes later, empty-handed. That same night, a second text came from Evelyn's phone, this time to her coworker, taking time off. "Tell them I'm okay." The grammar, the tone, none of it sounded like her. When officers checked the phone records, they found the text had been sent while Lucas's phone was connected to the same Wi-Fi network inside apartment 3B. Detective Grant didn't say it out loud yet, but everyone in the room understood. This wasn't a missing person case anymore. It was something else. In a town that prided itself on safety, Silvervale was about to learn what real fear looked like. Because somewhere between that final text and the first sunrise, Evelyn Hart's story had already ended, and only one person knew how. When Evelyn Hart's disappearance hit the evening news, Silvervale changed overnight. In a town where everyone thought they knew everyone, whispers turned into theories, and theories turned into fear. At first, people felt bad for Lucas Monroe, the boyfriend left behind, the man who filed the report and helped hang missing posters around Main Street. He stood beside volunteers, printed flyers at his own expense, gave interviews outside the apartment building. He looked tired, sad, lost. But for Detective Miles Grant, that was exactly the problem. Grant had been in homicide for nearly 20 years before transferring to Silvervale PD. He'd seen grief up close, real grief. It's messy. It cracks the voice, it makes people forget what day it is. Lucas didn't look cracked. He looked rehearsed. In the first few interviews, Grant noticed how Lucas spoke in timelines, specific hours, neat phrasing. "We argued around 10:30. She walked out. I went to bed. I woke up. She was gone." Every time, the same rhythm, same words, same sighs in the same places. The more Lucas talked, the more Grant felt like he was listening to a script. On the third day, officers asked Lucas for permission to check his car again, a black 2015 Camry parked behind Aspen Hollow Apartments. Lucas agreed immediately, almost too eagerly. When the forensic tech opened the trunk, they found a folded blanket, a bottle of disinfectant, and a roll of heavy-duty plastic wrap. All perfectly normal, Lucas said. I use those for cleaning spills at work. Grant didn't argue. He just made a note in his file: bartenders don't carry industrial plastic wrap. Technology rarely lies. While the public search continued, drone sweeps, volunteers combing through forest trails, Grant's team dug into the digital side. Evelyn's phone had gone silent the night she disappeared. But the texts sent afterward were full of clues. Linguistics experts compared the Evelyn messages to real ones from her previous months. Her usual texts were warm, chatty, full of exclamation marks. The ones sent after her disappearance were short, dry, punctuation perfect, almost mechanical. Grant had seen that before. When a suspect sends messages pretending to be someone else, they can never mimic the voice exactly. Phone records placed those texts inside the apartment Wi-Fi network, right next to Lucas's devices. It wasn't proof, not yet. But it was the first crack in the mask. 3 days into the search, Grant learned something new. A coworker of Lucas's, a young woman named Natalie Reeves, had called in sick. Twice. The manager at the Grand Horizon Resort mentioned she'd been acting strange, nervous, distracted. Grant asked her to come in for a conversation. When Natalie entered the station, she looked terrified, clutching her purse like a shield. Her voice trembled when she said, "I didn't know he lived with her. He told me they'd broken up months ago." She explained how she and Lucas had been seeing each other secretly. How he seemed charming but distant, how he'd started avoiding questions about his past. Then, last week, she'd found something that didn't fit, a photo of Lucas with a pregnant woman saved on his phone. When she confronted him, he said Evelyn was crazy, that she'd faked the pregnancy to trap him. He even showed Natalie what looked like a DNA test, a blurry PDF file on his laptop, labeled proof. Grant asked if she still had a copy. She did. That file became one of the biggest pieces of the puzzle. Forensic analysts quickly determined the document was fabricated. Metadata showed it had been downloaded from an online template editing site. Lucas had changed the names, dates, and printed it to show Natalie. To Grant, that changed everything. He now had a motive: control. Lucas wanted to erase a problem: 2 women, 1 truth. On June 1st, detectives brought Lucas back for what they called a follow-up interview. He didn't know the tone had changed. The room was bright, the air heavy with silence. Grant sat across from him, 2 cups of coffee on the table. One untouched. He started gently, reviewing the timeline. Then, without warning, he slid a photo across the table, a frame from the garage camera. "That you?" Lucas nodded. "Yeah, that's me." Grant tilted his head. "What's in the bags?" Lucas blinked once, smiled faintly. "Trash. From the apartment." Grant leaned back. "That's funny. Because we checked the dumpsters that morning. Empty." For the first time, Lucas's hand twitched. A single bead of sweat rolled down from his temple. Grant didn't press further. He simply stood, thanked him for his time, and walked out. Outside the room, he whispered to his partner, "He's breaking. It's just a matter of when." That same evening, around 6:40 p.m., a park ranger radioed dispatch. He found a partially burned blanket near a wooded area off Redwood Bluff Trail, about 6 miles from Silvervale. Underneath, something metallic, fragments of jewelry fused with melted plastic. When forensic units arrived, the smell of gasoline still lingered in the soil. Tests would later confirm it was Evelyn's DNA. The news broke before midnight. Headlines read, "Remains found believed to be missing woman from Silvervale." Neighbors gathered in silence outside Aspen Hollow, candles flickering in the drizzle. At 2:15 a.m., police returned to Lucas's apartment with a warrant. They collected his clothes, his phone, and 2 bottles of rodenticide hidden beneath the sink, the same kind found in hardware stores across town. By sunrise, Lucas Monroe was in custody. Interrogations can last hours, sometimes days. With Lucas, it took less than 5. At first, he denied everything, said the poison was for pests, said he'd burned trash, not evidence. But when confronted with the DNA test forgery, the text messages, and the garage footage, his composure cracked. His voice trembled as he said, "I didn't mean to. I just wanted her to stop." He described weeks of arguments, of feeling cornered. How he'd started slipping small doses of poison into her drinks, hoping she'd get sick and go home for treatment. When that didn't work, he said he lost control. The details were cold, flat, mechanical, as if he were describing someone else's actions. Grant wrote later in his notes, he showed no remorse. Only fear of exposure. For days, the town mourned. Evelyn's family arrived from Florida. They laid flowers at the base of the apartment building. People cried for a woman most of them had never met, because her story felt too close, too possible. Lucas Monroe was charged with first-degree murder, evidence tampering, and falsification of documents. At trial, his defense called it a crime of passion. The prosecution called it exactly what it was, premeditated. The jury took less than 3 hours. Life in prison. No parole. Grant attended the sentencing quietly, sitting in the back row. He said later, "Cases like this don't end when the verdict does. They echo." And they did. Within months, Silvervale held its first community forum on domestic abuse awareness. The local shelter doubled its funding. The Hart family started a foundation in Evelyn's name to support women seeking safe exits from toxic relationships. Every night around 9, the lights from Aspen Hollow apartments still flicker, motion sensors, probably nothing more. But for those who remember Evelyn, that flicker feels like a heartbeat. A reminder. Because evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears a smile, pours a drink, and says all the right things until it's too late. Evelyn Hart's story is no longer a mystery, but Silvervale will never forget how easily truth can hide in plain sight. By the time the trial began, Silvervale wasn't the same quiet mountain town it used to be. People had stopped saying things like "that don't happen here." Because now, everyone knew they could. The courthouse sat on a small hill overlooking Main Street, a brick building with white pillars and a single flag rippling against the wind. Inside, every seat was filled. Reporters lined the walls. Locals who once waved at Lucas Monroe across the bar now watched him through glass and steel, whispering to each other, trying to understand how someone who smiled that easily could hide so much darkness. Lucas sat in a gray suit, clean-shaven, calm as ever. The only thing different was the chain around his ankles, hidden beneath the table. Across the room sat Laura Hart, Evelyn's mother, a woman who had flown from Florida and hadn't slept since. Her hands trembled around a small pendant that once belonged to her daughter, the last thing she had left to hold. The prosecution began with one sentence. "This is not a story about anger. This is a story about control." They painted a picture that was almost too organized, a man who planned each step, from poison searches on his laptop to fake messages on his girlfriend's phone. They showed the timeline, the receipts, the surveillance video from the garage. Each piece fit like a puzzle snapping shut. Lucas's defense team tried to shift the tone. They called it a moment of panic, a tragic accident fueled by emotion. They said he'd snapped after feeling trapped in a relationship he didn't know how to leave. But when they showed his text messages, the ones mocking Evelyn's southern accent, the jokes that cut too deep, that theory began to crumble. The courtroom grew colder with every detail. When Natalie Reeves took the stand, the entire room leaned forward. She spoke quietly, her voice trembling at first, then steadying as she read from a written statement. She described how Lucas had lied to her, how he'd said Evelyn was gone, that the baby wasn't his, that he was finally free. She explained how she found the fake DNA test and how she called Evelyn, desperate to understand. Then, when asked why she didn't go to the police sooner, her eyes filled with tears. because I didn't believe what kind of person he really was. Not until it was too late. She paused, glanced toward Laura Hart, and whispered, "I'm sorry." Grant, sitting near the back, looked down. He'd seen 100 cases like this, but it never got easier, the ripple of damage spreading from one man's lie. Over the following days, experts filled the witness stand, forensic analysts, digital investigators, toxicologists. They explained how traces of rodenticide were found in Evelyn's kitchen sink and in her bloodstream. They showed screenshots from Lucas's computer, search histories about poisons, about symptoms during pregnancy, about how long before it shows. The jury didn't need dramatics. The facts spoke for themselves. Grant called it a textbook of premeditation disguised as charm. The prosecutor ended her questioning with a simple line. Mr. Monroe didn't lose control. He lost ownership of a lie, and that, to him, was unforgivable. When Lucas finally testified, his voice was calm, even measured. He said he was sorry, not for what he'd done, but for how things spiraled. He said he never meant to hurt Evelyn, that he just wanted things to go back to normal. But the courtroom could feel it, the emptiness behind his words. There was no remorse, only regret for being caught. At one point, he turned toward the gallery, meeting Laura Hart's eyes. She didn't look away. Her stare didn't hold hate, it held something deeper, heavier, the question of why. Lucas blinked first. The jury deliberated for just under 3 hours. When they returned, the room was silent. The foreman's voice barely rose above a whisper. We find the defendant, Lucas Monroe, guilty of first-degree murder. For a moment, nothing moved. Then a quiet gasp escaped from the gallery, not triumph, not relief, just the sound of grief finally breathing. Laura Hart covered her mouth and cried softly. Natalie wept silently beside her. Detective Grant stared down at his notes, pen frozen mid-sentence. The judge's voice was steady. Mr. Monroe, you are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Lucas didn't react. No outburst, no tears. Just a blank stare forward. As bailiffs led him away, the sound of his footsteps echoed through the courtroom like the final punctuation of a story no one wanted to hear. Outside, the air was cold and clean. Reporters crowded around the courthouse steps, cameras clicking, microphones thrust toward anyone willing to speak. Laura Hart simply said, I hope no one else has to go through what my daughter did. Then she turned, clutching that small pendant against her chest, and walked away. Detective Grant stood a few feet back, watching her disappear down the sidewalk. He'd been in law enforcement long enough to know that justice never feels like victory. It just feels quieter. The following week, the Silvervale Gazette ran a headline, Hart case verdict brings closure and change. But closure is never simple. Silvervale's police department started new protocols on missing person cases. Local shelters received funding from an anonymous donor, later revealed to be the Hart Family Foundation. They called it the Evelyn Project. It offered housing and legal aid to women trying to leave dangerous relationships. Natalie Reeves moved away from town. She kept her job in hospitality but never spoke publicly again. Those close to her said she volunteered quietly with domestic violence charities under another name. Detective Grant took a short leave after the trial. He told colleagues he needed to see sunlight that wasn't through glass. But he returned eventually. Cases like this didn't drive him away. They reminded him why he stayed. Sometimes, he'd stop by Aspen Hollow Apartments on his drive home. Unit 3B remained empty for months. The balcony plants Evelyn once kept had wilted, their pots still sitting there, collecting rain. He once said to a colleague, if you listen close, you can still hear the wind pass through that hallway. It sounds like her, calm, steady, still trying to make sense of it all. 1 year later, on May 28th, Silvervale held a candlelight vigil in the town square. Hundreds gathered, friends, neighbors, strangers who only knew Evelyn's face from headlines. Laura Hart spoke briefly, her voice quiet but strong. Evelyn was light. She believed people could change. She believed kindness could fix things. If you take anything from her story, let it be this: listen when someone's afraid, even if they smile when they say they're fine. The crowd stood in silence. Candles flickered like stars in the mountain wind. And for a moment, the town felt whole again, not healed, but aware. Grant stood at the edge of the crowd, hands in his coat pockets. He looked toward the horizon where the lights of Aspen Hollow glimmered faintly against the night. People think justice ends a story, he thought. But sometimes, it's just the beginning of another kind of memory. The flame in his candle trembled, almost went out, then steadied again. Evelyn Hart didn't live to tell her story, but through the people who did, her truth survived. Silvervale will always carry her name, not as a tragedy, but as a warning. A reminder that monsters rarely hide in the dark. They hide in plain sight, behind smiles, promises, and the comfort of the familiar. And every time the wind moves through the pines above that little town, it sounds like her voice whispering, "I'm still here. Don't forget." A year and a half had passed since the verdict, and Silvervale had learned to live with its ghosts. The courthouse was quiet now, its steps washed clean by rain and time. But some names never fade, and Evelyn Hart's was one of them. Detective Miles Grant still carried her case file in the top drawer of his desk, not because he had to, but because he couldn't let it go. Every few weeks he opened it, read the first page, and closed it again. Habit, maybe. Or ritual. He'd seen too many endings that looked like closure but weren't. Evelyn's file reminded him that behind every headline there's a family trying to rebuild from rubble that can't be seen. Silvervale had changed. The downtown bar where Lucas Monroe once worked was sold to new owners, repainted, renamed the Lantern Room. Most locals still avoided the corner booth where he used to stand behind the counter, mixing drinks and small talk. Aspen Hollow Apartments, where Evelyn had lived, remained half empty for months. Tenants moved in, stayed a few weeks, and moved out again. They said the walls felt heavy. They said the silence was too thick. In time, a young couple finally rented Unit 3B. They redecorated, replaced the carpet, and painted the walls a light blue. One evening, when the woman hung new curtains, she found a small brass key wedged behind the window frame, the kind that didn't fit any modern lock. She kept it in a drawer, not knowing what it belonged to. Sometimes, when the wind blew through the hallway, she swore she heard soft footsteps. But maybe that was just the building settling, or memory echoing through walls. After the trial, Laura Hart threw herself into work. With support from the state and donations from strangers, the Evelyn Project grew faster than anyone expected. It opened offices in 3 counties, offering housing, legal help, and crisis counseling. Local news covered its first anniversary with a quiet headline, "From Loss to Legacy." Laura spoke at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, her voice calm but steady. "My daughter believed in helping people find home," she said. "We just changed what that word means." Behind her stood volunteers, teachers, nurses, college students, people who had followed the story and wanted to do something that mattered. For a moment, the crowd felt something rare in stories like this, purpose instead of pain. By early 2025, Detective Grant was back full-time. He looked older, gray had spread through his hair, and the lines around his eyes were deeper. But he worked cases with the same quiet focus as always. He never spoke publicly about Evelyn Hart again, but his methods changed. He started treating every missing person report as urgent from minute one. He pushed new recruits to listen more than they talked. "People don't vanish out of nowhere," he told them. "They leave ripples. If you look close enough, you'll see them." One evening, while sorting cold case files, he found an unsigned letter slipped under his office door. The handwriting was neat, careful. "Thank you for believing her. N." He didn't need to ask who it was from. He folded it once, placed it inside Evelyn's file, and locked the drawer. Natalie Reeves moved to Denver, changed apartments, changed everything she could. She stopped using social media, took a new position at a boutique hotel, and avoided any mention of Silvervale. Still, some nights she woke up at 3 a.m., hearing echoes, a voice saying, "Are you sure?" She'd learned that guilt doesn't fade, it just changes shape. Eventually, she began volunteering at a women's resource center downtown. She didn't tell anyone her story. She didn't have to. The empathy in her eyes said enough. One winter evening, as she closed the center's office, she found an envelope taped to the door, no address, just a pressed white lily inside and a single note, "You did the right thing." For the first time in years, she slept through the night. 2 years later, a production crew came to Silvervale to film a true crime documentary about the case. They wanted interviews, photos, old footage. The director met with Detective Grant at the station. He agreed to talk, on one condition. "No dramatization," he said. "Tell it the way it was." The episode aired that fall. It didn't focus on the violence, it focused on the warning signs, the control, the isolation, the manipulation that everyone mistook for love. Viewers praised it for being honest instead of sensational. For a week, the town buzzed again with talk of Evelyn Hart. But this time, the tone was different. People didn't just remember what had happened. They started noticing patterns, friends pulling away from family, coworkers covering bruises with makeup, neighbors making excuses. Calls to local hotlines tripled in 1 month. Grant told a reporter later, "If telling her story saved even one person, that's the closest thing to justice I know." 3 years after his conviction, a letter arrived at the district attorney's office from the state penitentiary. The return name read, Lucas Monroe. Inside was a single paragraph written in small, neat handwriting. "I think about that night every day. I wish I could say I understand why I did it, but I don't. Sometimes I dream she's still alive. In those dreams, she never speaks." The DA didn't respond. The letter was sealed, archived, and forgotten, but somehow, a copy made its way into the case file on Grant's desk. He read it once, said nothing, and placed it back under lock and key. Each year on May 28th, the people of Silvervale gather in the town square for a candlelight vigil. It isn't an official event, no flyers, no speeches, no press. Just people who remember. This year, Detective Grant arrived late. The mountains were wrapped in fog, the air damp and cold. He stood at the edge of the crowd, candle flickering in his hand. Laura Hart saw him, walked over, and stood beside him without a word. After a long silence, she said, "You ever wonder if she'd want us to stop coming here?" Grant thought for a moment. "No," he said. "She'd want us to keep the light on." A faint breeze passed through, making every candle flame tremble, hundreds of tiny lights swaying together. Somewhere in that glow, it almost felt like Evelyn was there, watching quietly, reminding them that memory isn't about pain. It's about what survives it. Years later, people still talk about the Silvervale case. Students study it in criminal justice classes, advocates use it in seminars about coercive control. The case that once broke a town now educates thousands. Grant eventually retired, moving to a small cabin near the lake. He keeps a box of old photos on his bookshelf, case files, newspaper clippings, and one picture of Evelyn at an open house event, smiling, holding a sold sign in front of a new home. Sometimes he sits on his porch at dusk, watching the light fade across the water, thinking about the people he couldn't save and the few he could. When asked if he'd ever write a book about the case, he said, "No. Some stories should stay as warnings, not entertainment." The Silvervale case didn't end with a sentence. It began a conversation, one that still echoes in quiet towns, in small apartments, in the places where trust becomes control. Evelyn Hart's story reminds us that evil doesn't arrive in shadows. It shows up smiling, patient, ordinary. And yet, even after everything, there's light, the kind that flickers but never burns out. The mountains of Silvervale look different now. The sharp edges that once cut into the skyline had softened, blurred by years of rain and time. The town had grown a little, a new grocery store, a renovated library, a few more houses tucked into the hills, but its heartbeat was the same. Quiet. Careful. Watchful. Every May, as spring bled into summer, the light turned gold around sunset. That's when people said you could still feel her, Evelyn Hart, in the air, in the stillness, in the way the sun lingered a few seconds longer before disappearing behind the pines. Detective Miles Grant had been retired for 4 years now. He traded long nights in the precinct for quiet mornings on the lake. His cabin sat on the north shore, where the water mirrored the mountains perfectly on calm days. Sometimes he'd sit outside with a mug of coffee, the steam rising in the cold air, watching ducks drift across the surface. On his porch was an old wooden chair and a single cardboard box, the same one he'd taken from his office the day he left the department. Inside, carefully stacked, were a few case files, newspaper clippings, and photographs. The top one always stayed the same: Evelyn Hart, missing, May 28, 2023. He didn't open it often anymore, but he never put it away either. Some stories don't belong in archives, they belong where you can see them, where they remind you of what truth costs. One morning, just as the fog was lifting off the lake, Grant heard a car on the gravel road. A woman stepped out, early 30s, long brown coat, short dark hair, eyes that carried both calm and sadness. She hesitated before walking up the steps. "Detective Grant?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Used to be. You can just call me Miles now." She smiled faintly. "You probably don't remember me. My name's Chloe Reeves. Natalie's sister." Grant's expression softened. He motioned her to sit. "I remember the name." Chloe told him that Natalie had moved again, this time out of state. She'd built a quiet life, working in advocacy full-time, but still refused to talk publicly about the case. "She says she's done living in the shadow of it," Chloe said. "But she wanted me to thank you. She said you never treated her like part of the problem." Grant looked out at the water for a long moment before answering. "She wasn't. She just didn't know what she was standing next to." They sat in silence after that, listening to the wind move through the trees. Before leaving, Chloe handed him an envelope. "She wanted you to have this." Inside was a small photo, Natalie with a group of women at a fundraiser, all smiling, candles glowing behind them. On the back, a line written in neat handwriting: "It's easier to heal when you stop asking why and start helping someone else." Grant placed the photo inside the old case file, next to Evelyn's. By its 5th year, the Evelyn Project had become one of the most respected advocacy groups in the state. It had opened shelters, funded hotline centers, and even trained police departments on handling domestic abuse cases. Laura Hart still oversaw it, though she had stepped back from public appearances. Her hair had turned silver, and she preferred staying in the background now, working quietly from her office in Naples. But every spring she returned to Silvervale, not for press or ceremony, but to walk the trails her daughter once loved. Sometimes she'd stop at Redwood Bluff, the same place where Evelyn's remains were found. Locals had turned the area into a memorial garden, filled with wildflowers and benches. A small bronze plaque at the entrance read, "In memory of those whose voices were taken, may their stories light the way for others." Laura would sit there for hours, just listening to the wind through the grass. Some days she cried. Other days she smiled. Both felt like healing. The documentary about the Silvervale case had inspired something unexpected, a book deal. Not for Detective Grant, not for reporters, but for a young writer named Sophie Keller, who grew up in the town and remembered the case unfolding when she was just 15. Her book wasn't a crime exposé. It was a reflection about trust, fear, and how silence spreads. She interviewed volunteers, officers, survivors, but never sensationalized the story. Her first line read, "Evelyn Hart's life didn't end with violence. It ended with someone's choice not to listen." The book became a quiet success, used in college programs and advocacy workshops. It wasn't a bestseller, but it mattered. And in small towns like Silvervale, that meant more. That same year, a local paper asked Grant to write a reflection for their community column, "Lessons from a Lifetime in Law Enforcement." He hesitated, then wrote something simple. "You don't realize how fragile people are until you see how easy it is to make them disappear, not physically, but emotionally. The Silvervale case taught me that danger doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, every day, until the person you love starts to believe they're the problem." If you ever see that happening, speak. Don't wait for the evidence. The evidence always comes too late. The editor published it in full, front page, without edits. For weeks, letters came in from readers, survivors, parents, even young men saying they recognized pieces of themselves in his words. Grant didn't respond to any of them. He just folded the paper and put it inside the file. One evening, near the end of May, the sky over Silvervale turned a deep orange, the kind of sunset Evelyn used to photograph. The town square filled again with candles, as it did every year. Grant was there, as always. He stood near the edge, hands in his pockets, watching people gather. He saw Laura Hart across the crowd, lighting a candle, her face calm in the fading light. Children played quietly nearby, unaware of the story that had brought everyone here. As night settled, Grant stepped forward, placing his candle on the memorial steps. He whispered, "We kept the light on, Evelyn." A breeze swept through, and every candle flickered at once, as if in answer. The crowd fell silent. No speeches, no tears, just the steady glow of hundreds of tiny flames against the mountain night. Grant stayed until the last candle went out. Then he walked back to his car, the sound of crickets rising behind him. As he started the engine, he looked once more toward Aspen Hollow in the distance, the building barely visible through the mist, a few windows still lit. He smiled faintly. "You did it," he said quietly. "They remember." He drove away slowly, the road curling between the trees, headlights tracing the path home. The Silvervale case became more than a crime story. It became a warning, a movement, a memory stitched into the fabric of a town that refused to forget. And as the years went by, people stopped talking about the murder, they talked about the message. In a small cabin by the lake, under the whisper of pine trees, a retired detective would sometimes wake before dawn, make coffee, and sit outside watching the sunrise. He'd see the light spread across the water, soft and golden, and think about how even after darkness, light always finds a way back. He didn't say her name out loud anymore. He didn't have to. The silence carried it for him. Because in Silvervale, the story of Evelyn Hart never truly ended, it simply became part of the air everyone breathed. The wind quiets. The final image, a single candle burning beside a framed photo of Evelyn, its flame steady against the morning light. Morning came slowly over Silvervale, the light creeping over the mountains in thin gold lines. The fog on the lake drifted like smoke, dissolving into the early sun. Miles Grant sat on his porch, coffee steaming in his hands, the same way he did every morning. The world was quiet except for the sound of water lapping against the dock and birds calling from the trees. It had been 6 years since the trial, and life had become smaller, quieter, simpler. The silence that once haunted him now felt like company. He no longer woke up thinking about the case every day, but some days, he still did. The cabin smelled faintly of pine and old books. On the table beside him sat the worn box that had followed him everywhere since retirement. Inside were fragments of a life's work, reports, photographs, handwritten notes. The folder marked Evelyn Hart was still on top, its corners bent and soft from use. Sometimes he wondered why he kept it so close. Maybe it was habit, maybe guilt, maybe something like love for a stranger whose story had changed him forever. He opened it just long enough to look at the photograph that Natalie's sister had given him, the one from the fundraiser, where women smiled under candlelight. Beneath it was another photo, older, of Evelyn standing in front of a sold house, the wind in her hair, her smile confident and unguarded. Grant looked at it for a long time, the morning sun sliding across her face like a memory returning to light. He closed the folder gently, like tucking something fragile back into sleep. A knock on the door broke the quiet. He stood, slow but steady, and opened it to see a young man holding a notebook and a small camera. "Mr. Grant?" the stranger asked. "I'm sorry to bother you. My name's Eli Turner. I'm working on a piece for the state paper about unresolved cases and their impact. I was hoping you might talk to me about Silvervale." Grant almost said no. He didn't want to relive it again, to peel back the scab. But something in the young man's eyes, a kind of genuine curiosity mixed with respect, made him pause. You drove all the way up here for that? Grant asked. Yes, sir, Eli said. It's not really about the crime. It's about what came after, how the town changed, what it learned. Grant studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. All right, he said. Come on in. They sat on the porch, the morning air crisp and full of light. Eli asked questions softly, careful not to pry too deep. Do you think cases like this ever really end? He asked. Grant thought about that. And, he said slowly. Not really. They just stop taking up space in the papers and start taking up space in people. He gestured toward the lake. See that water? You throw a stone in, and the ripples go farther than you can see. They don't disappear, they just fade out of sight. Eli scribbled a note. So the ripples are the people left behind? Grant nodded. Exactly. Families, friends, even people like me. We all carry a piece of it, whether we want to or not. But carrying it isn't always bad. Sometimes it reminds you to do better. They talked for nearly an hour. When it was time to leave, Eli thanked him, slipping his notebook back into his bag. Before he reached the car, he turned and said, You know, everyone in town still talks about you. They say you never stopped looking, even when others gave up. Grant smiled faintly. They give me too much credit. It was Evelyn's mother who never stopped. Eli nodded. She said something once that stuck with me. That justice isn't about punishment, it's about making sure people remember. Grant looked out at the lake again, the sunlight glinting like tiny mirrors. She's right, he said quietly. That's all it ever is. When Eli drove away, the sound of gravel faded into the hum of wind through the pines. Grant sat for a while longer, letting the quiet settle back in. He picked up the old file box and carried it inside, setting it on the shelf beside a row of books. He paused, then reached for the framed photo of Evelyn he kept on his desk. It wasn't a police photo, not evidence, just a picture printed from an old article, the kind where she looked alive and real. He placed it on the mantel above the fireplace, beside a small brass key he found years ago while revisiting Aspen Hollow. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the mountains, Grant lit a single candle and set it next to the photo. The flame flickered gently, casting long shadows across the cabin walls. He sat down, watching it burn. For the first time, he realized he didn't feel the same heaviness anymore. The grief had softened into something else, gratitude, maybe. Gratitude that her story hadn't been lost. Gratitude that the town had learned, even if it was too late for her. Outside, the air was cool and still. The lake reflected the last colors of the day, orange fading to blue, then to silver. A loon called across the water, low and haunting. Grant closed his eyes and listened. He thought of the people he'd met along the way, Laura, Natalie, even Allegra, and how every one of them had found a different way to keep living. Maybe that was the only real justice the world could offer, the choice to continue, even when it hurts. As night deepened, he reached for his notebook and began to write. Not a report, not a statement, just thoughts. A letter to no one. He wrote about Evelyn's courage, about how love twisted into control without anyone noticing, about the warning signs he wished he'd seen sooner. And at the end, he wrote a single line, sometimes the hardest part of finding the truth is forgiving yourself for not seeing it sooner. He tore the page out, folded it neatly, and tucked it inside the case file before closing the lid one final time. Then he blew out the candle and stood, letting the last curl of smoke fade into the dark. The cabin filled with silence again, but it was a peaceful kind, the kind that feels like rest, not emptiness. When morning came again, Miles Grant woke to sunlight spilling across the floor. He stepped outside, breathing in the mountain air. The lake was still, perfectly smooth, reflecting the sky above. For a moment, it looked endless. He took a sip of coffee and smiled to himself, quiet and content. Somewhere, a new day was beginning. Somewhere, someone was listening. And in that silence, with the soft hum of the wind and the golden light rising over Silvervale, the story of Evelyn Hart, of truth, of loss, of light that refused to die, kept on living, one breath at a time. The following winter in Silvervale was the coldest anyone could remember. The mountain stayed white well into March, and the lake froze thick enough to walk across. From his cabin window, Miles Grant watched the world fall silent under snow. Time had softened everything, the anger, the noise, the endless questions. What remained was stillness, and the strange comfort of knowing that stories, once told, never really die. One morning, while sweeping the porch, he noticed a letter in his mailbox. The handwriting was unfamiliar, sharp, deliberate. Inside was a single page. "Mr. Grant," it began, "you don't know me, but you once worked with my mother. She was one of the volunteers at the Evelyn Project. She passed away last year, but before she did, she told me that helping others saved her life. I thought you should know that her work continues. My sister and I run a small shelter now, and we keep a candle lit every night. She said it started with your story." Grant folded the letter slowly, his breath rising in the cold. The words sat heavy in his hands, but not in a painful way, more like a quiet weight he was willing to carry. He walked back inside and placed the letter beside the file box on his shelf. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, bending the branches but never breaking them. He smiled at that. Silvervale had bent, too, but it had not broken. That afternoon, the phone rang. It was Laura Hart. "Miles," she said, her voice older now, softer, "I didn't want to bother you, but the university is dedicating a scholarship in Evelyn's name next week. They're asking if you'd like to say something. Just a few words." He hesitated. "You know I don't do speeches." "I know," she said with a hint of warmth. "But you knew her story better than anyone." He looked out the window at the lake, sunlight glinting off the ice. "All right," he said after a pause. "I'll come." The ceremony took place in the university's small auditorium, filled with students, professors, and families. The stage was simple, just a podium, a large photograph of Evelyn smiling, and a table with candles flickering softly. Grant hadn't been in a crowd like this for years. When his name was called, he walked to the podium slowly, feeling the eyes on him, the weight of memory in the air. He looked at the photograph first, then at the student sitting in the front row. "I used to think stories like this ended with justice," he began, his voice calm and low. "But the truth is, they don't. They end when people stop listening. When they stop caring." Evelyn Hart was more than what happened to her. She was a daughter, a dreamer, someone who believed she could make the world better. And in a way, she did, because you're all here, carrying that light forward. He paused, glancing down at his hands. "When I worked her case, I thought the job was about finding answers. Now I know it's about making sure the questions keep being asked. The next time you see something that doesn't feel right, someone afraid, someone silent, don't look away. That's where change begins." He stepped back from the podium. For a moment, no one moved. Then applause rose, slow at first, then filling the hall. Laura Hart stood near the aisle, her eyes wet but her smile steady. Afterward, she walked up to him and placed her hand on his arm. "You finally said what she would have wanted," she whispered. Outside, snow began to fall again. The crowd left quietly, their voices fading into the cold air. Grant stood for a moment beneath the falling flakes, watching the students walk away holding their candles. Each one glowed like a star against the white night. Back at his cabin, he set the program from the ceremony on his desk. He added a small note to it before slipping it into the case file. "For every story that ends, another begins." Then he closed the folder for the last time. That night, he dreamed of the lake, not the way it looked now, frozen and still, but the way it had been in summer, water shining like glass, the air warm and full of birdsong. Evelyn was standing by the dock, laughing, holding a camera to the light. When she turned toward him, she said only one thing, "You did it." Then she walked away into the sun. He woke before dawn, the dream still alive in his mind. He didn't try to sleep again. Instead, he lit the small candle on his desk and watched the flame flicker. Outside, the first light of morning crept across the snow. He could hear the ice on the lake shifting, cracking open as the temperature began to rise. Spring was coming. Grant stepped outside and took a deep breath of the cold air. The sky above the mountains was turning pink, soft, and bright. He smiled to himself, feeling something he hadn't in years: release. The world was moving forward, and so was he. He poured the last of his coffee into the frozen earth and whispered, "Goodbye, Evelyn." The wind carried the sound across the lake, through the trees, and up toward the sun. And for just a second, the light on the water shimmered like fire, alive, beautiful, endless. Miles Grant stood there until the sun rose fully, warming his face. Then he turned back toward the cabin, the door creaking softly behind him as it closed. Inside, the candle still burned on the desk, its flame steady and bright, a single point of light holding against the morning. In Silvervale, that was how stories survived, not in the noise of tragedy, but in the quiet persistence of those who refused to forget. The mountains would keep their secrets, the town would go on, and somewhere deep within it, the echo of one woman's life would continue to remind them all, even the smallest light can outlast the longest night. Spring came early that year in Silvervale. The ice on the lake cracked and shimmered under the sunlight, the sound echoing faintly through the valley. Days grew longer, the air warmer, and the pine trees that once stood heavy with snow began to breathe again. Life was returning, slowly, quietly, but surely. Miles Grant had stopped counting the years. Time moved differently now, measured not by cases or seasons, but by small things: the first robin's song, the smell of rain after a storm, the way the morning light spilled through his cabin window. Each day began the same: coffee steaming in his hands, the sound of the lake shifting outside, and the faint hum of a world moving on without him. He didn't mind. He'd spent his whole life chasing truth, but in retirement, he had learned that some truths didn't need chasing, they came to you when you were ready to see them. One morning in April, as he opened the door to fetch firewood, a small envelope rested on the step. No stamp, no return address. Just his name written in delicate handwriting, Miles. Inside was a folded piece of paper with a single sentence written neatly across it: "We're still keeping the light on." He smiled, immediately knowing who it was from. The volunteers at the Evelyn Project had adopted that phrase after his last speech at the university. It had become their quiet motto, printed on brochures, whispered in meetings, and carved into the plaque at the new shelter they built in Evelyn's memory. Grant walked down to the lake, the letter in his pocket. The surface was calm, reflecting the blue of the sky, with streaks of silver rippling through it. He could see his own reflection there, older, lined, but peaceful. He thought about all the people who had crossed his path in that case: Laura Hart, whose strength had redefined what love looked like; Natalie Reeves, who had turned guilt into purpose; Allegra Monroe, whose testimony had changed everything. All of them had carried something heavy once. And somehow, all of them had found a way to set it down. He picked up a smooth stone from the shore and turned it in his hand. "For her," he said softly, and tossed it across the lake. It skipped 3 times before sinking. The ripples spread outward until the whole surface shimmered with light. Inside the cabin, the candle still stood beside Evelyn's photograph. He lit it again that afternoon, even though it was bright outside. The flame danced gently, its reflection flickering across the glass frame. He sat at his desk, opened his old notebook, and began to write. Not a case report, not a confession, just words. A memory, a story. He wrote about a small town where darkness fell one spring and how, years later, light still lingered in the cracks. He wrote about the way grief bends time, how it teaches you to see people differently, to see them as fragile, unfinished stories that matter more than the endings. And he wrote about Evelyn Hart, not as a victim, but as a person whose life had sparked something far greater than she ever knew. By the time he finished, the sun was setting over the lake. The orange light spilled across the desk, warming his hands. He closed the notebook, ran his fingers over the cover, and whispered, "It's time." That evening, he drove into town for the first time in months. Silvervale looked different now, brighter, more alive. The new community center bore Evelyn's name etched into bronze above the door. Children were playing outside, their laughter echoing through the square. The mural on the wall behind them showed the silhouette of a woman standing at the edge of a lake, her reflection shining like sunlight on water. Grant parked and stood for a moment, taking it all in. He didn't go inside. He didn't need to. The town had become what she dreamed of, a place where people looked out for each other, where silence didn't win anymore. On his way back home, he stopped at the edge of the forest road, stepping out to watch the mountains fade into dusk. The wind carried the smell of pine and earth, and in the distance, the faint glow of the town's streetlights flickered like stars. He thought about what Laura had once said, that healing wasn't about forgetting, it was about remembering differently. He finally understood what she meant. Memory wasn't meant to hold you back. It was meant to guide you forward. When he returned to the cabin, the candle had burned low, its light soft and golden. He sat down in his chair, closed his eyes, and let the warmth of the room wrap around him. Somewhere outside, an owl called through the trees. The fire crackled softly. The world was quiet again. And in that quiet, Miles Grant felt something he hadn't in years, complete. He whispered one last time, almost to himself, "You can rest now, Evelyn." The candle flickered, its flame steady and strong, reflecting in the photograph beside it. Morning would come again, and with it, the light would spread across the lake just as it always did. Because in Silvervale, some lights never went out, they only changed hands. Summer settled over Silvervale with the kind of calm that made time feel slower. The mountains shimmered in the heat, the lake no longer frozen but smooth and still, reflecting clouds that drifted lazily overhead. The town had long moved past the headlines, yet somehow, Evelyn Hart's story still lived quietly in its corners, in the memorial garden, in whispered conversations, in the way people looked out for one another a little more carefully than before. Miles Grant felt the difference every time he walked through town. Strangers greeted him by name now, not as detective, but simply Miles. The bakery owner would slip him an extra piece of pie, the librarian always had a new book waiting on the counter. He didn't talk much about the past anymore, but people didn't need him to. They already knew what he stood for. One afternoon, as he returned from town with groceries, he found a car parked by his cabin. A woman stood by the lake, her reflection wavering in the water. She turned as he approached, Sophie Keller, the young writer whose book had once reignited the conversation about the case. She looked older now, more confident. "Mr. Grant," she said with a smile, "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," he said, setting down the bags. "It's good to see you. What brings you out here?" She held up a folder. "I'm working on something new, not about the case, but about what happens after. About towns that survive tragedy and the people who help them rebuild. I thought Silvervale might be a good place to start." Grant motioned for her to sit on the porch. The air smelled like pine and lake water. "You're not wrong," he said. "This place used to be haunted. Now it's awake." They talked for hours, about memory, about justice, about what it means to move on without forgetting. Sophie asked questions, but not like a reporter. More like someone searching for truth, quietly, gently. "Do you think closure really exists?" she asked at one point. Grant leaned back, looking at the horizon. "Closure's a word people use when they're tired of carrying something," he said. "But I think it's more like a scar. It never disappears, you just stop checking if it's healed." She nodded, writing it down. "That's beautiful," she said. Before leaving, she handed him a small gift, a thin paperback copy of her book, The Ripple Effect. Inside the front cover, she'd written, "For Miles Grant, who taught us that justice begins with listening." He didn't say anything, just smiled, running his thumb across the words as if memorizing the feel of them. That night, he sat by the lake, reading by candlelight. Each page carried a piece of Silvervale, the people, the places, the grief, and the grace. When he finished, he closed the book and looked up at the stars. The water glowed faintly beneath them, a mirror of light. Days turned into weeks, and the town prepared for the 10th anniversary of Evelyn Hart's death. Laura Hart had written to ask if he would attend the ceremony at the new community center. "It's not about mourning," she'd said in her note. It's about gratitude. When the day came, Silvervale gathered again. The square was filled with flowers and lanterns, children running between the benches, laughter mingling with the hum of conversation. The plaque at the center read, "The Evelyn Hart Foundation, for every life rebuilt." Grant stood among the crowd, unnoticed at first. He liked it that way. He watched Laura speak from the steps, her voice strong but soft, her silver hair catching the sunlight. "Evelyn's story taught us that silence is dangerous," she said. "So today, we don't stand in silence. We stand in promise." Applause rose, but it wasn't loud, it was steady, like waves against the shore. Grant felt something loosen in his chest. The sound wasn't for him. It wasn't even for Evelyn anymore. It was for everyone who had found strength in her story. After the ceremony, Laura found him near the edge of the square. They didn't speak much, they didn't need to. "You kept your promise," she said finally. "So did you," he replied. They stood for a while, watching children light paper lanterns and set them afloat on the small pond beside the community center. The lanterns drifted slowly, their reflections glowing in the water, hundreds of tiny stars moving together. That evening, when Grant returned to his cabin, the air was still warm. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and stepped out onto the porch. The lake shimmered in the fading light, and fireflies danced above the water. He thought about how far everything had come, from the darkness that once consumed the town to the calm that now defined it. He sat down and whispered into the dusk, "You can rest now, Evelyn. They don't need me anymore." The wind rustled through the trees, soft and low, as if answering him. The candle inside flickered, casting a warm glow through the cabin window. He leaned back, eyes half closed, listening to the steady rhythm of the lake. Somewhere across the water, a child laughed, bright and unafraid. Miles Grant smiled. For the first time, it didn't feel like the end of something. It felt like the beginning of peace. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the last of the light lingered over Silvervale, soft, golden, endless. The following autumn in Silvervale was the gentlest one in years. The air carried the faint scent of pine and smoke, and the town's lake mirrored the sky so perfectly that it was hard to tell where the water ended and the clouds began. Life had settled into its rhythm again, shops opening at sunrise, children racing bicycles down the cobblestone streets, and people greeting one another with the kind of warmth that comes only from shared history. Miles Grant had grown used to the quiet. The old detective no longer woke up before dawn out of habit. Instead, he rose with the sunlight, fed the stray cat that had decided his porch was home, and brewed coffee strong enough to stir the chill from the mountain air. The cabin had aged with him, its wood creaked when the wind blew, and the chimney leaned just slightly to one side. Yet it felt alive, full of warmth and echoes of memory. One morning, a knock came at the door. When he opened it, a young woman stood outside, wrapped in a long gray coat, a notebook pressed against her chest. "Mr. Grant," she asked politely. "My name is Emily Turner. I'm a graduate student at the university in Denver. I'm writing my thesis on community healing after trauma. I've read everything about the Silvervale case, and about you." Grant smiled faintly, stepping aside to let her in. "You've come a long way for an old man's memories," he said. "I'm not here for the case," she replied. "I'm here for the legacy." She spoke softly but with conviction. Over tea, she told him how the Evelyn Hart Foundation had become a national network, how its programs had saved lives, how cities across the country were adopting its model. "It started here," she said, gesturing toward the window, where the lake glowed faintly in the distance. "It started with you." Grant shook his head. "No," he said. "It started with her. I just followed the trail she left behind." Emily smiled. "Maybe. But you kept it from fading." They spent the day talking, about the case, yes, but more about the people who came after, the families, the volunteers, the quiet heroes who turned pain into purpose. As dusk fell, Emily closed her notebook and asked, "Do you ever think about writing it down yourself? Not the facts, but the feeling?" Grant looked at the fading light outside, the gold of the sunset spilling across the water. "I used to think I might," he said. But stories like this, they don't belong to one person anymore. They belong to everyone who remembers. When she left, she handed him a small envelope. "A thank you," she said. "You'll understand when you read it." After she drove away, Grant opened the envelope. Inside was a photograph of a group of young people standing in front of a city shelter with a new plaque that read the Evelyn Hart Center for Safety and Support. On the back, someone had written, "For every light that stayed on because of you." He sat for a long time, looking at it. The lake shimmered in the last orange light of day. He thought of Evelyn, of Laura, of Natalie, of all the lives that had intertwined to create something larger than themselves. The past no longer felt heavy, it felt complete. That night, as darkness settled over the mountains, he went down to the dock. The air was crisp and full of the smell of cedar. He carried a single lantern with him, one of the same kind used in the town's memorials. He set it on the water and watched it drift away, its golden light gliding across the surface until it became just another star reflected in the lake. "Good night, kid," he said softly. "You did it." He stayed there until the light disappeared into the mist. Then he turned back toward the cabin, his breath visible in the cool air. Inside, the cat was curled by the fire, and the room glowed warm and steady. On the mantel sat the same photograph of Evelyn and the small brass key beside it. He picked it up one last time, weighing it in his palm, then set it gently in a wooden box. Closing the lid, he whispered, "Time to rest." Outside, the wind moved through the pines, carrying with it the faint sound of laughter from across the lake, the town still awake, still alive, still keeping the light on. As the fire crackled softly, Miles Grant leaned back in his chair, the peace on his face unmistakable. He closed his eyes, listening to the world he'd helped rebuild, a world where truth had finally outlasted pain. And when morning came, the first light broke over Silvervale once more, golden and bright, touching the surface of the lake like a blessing. The mountains stood quiet and eternal, holding the echoes of a story that would never truly end, because in Silvervale, love and memory had become one and the same. The candle on the mantel flickered, steady as ever, its flame small but unyielding. Outside, the sun rose fully, filling the valley with light. And for the first time, it felt like forever.